Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be finishing up chapter 14 where we left off last time and concluding in chapter 17. And if you're just joining in, please email me at becauseloveneverfails@gmail.com and I will send you the chronological study Bible that we're going through right now. And I will need your physical address. And having this particular Bible is important because we're going through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and specifically in this Bible, and it takes the books of the Bible chronologically as they show up in history. So there's a different ordering here again based on historical timeline. All right, picking up in at the end of 14, tithing was the topic here in verses 22 through 27, and the tithe mentioned here, there seems to be a first tithe and a secondary tithe. So the first tithe would be the tithe that belongs to God, right? So it would just be this offering to God, and it completely belongs to God. And then the secondary tithe or festival tithe, where in the festival tithe, the offerer could eat of the offering. And then also at the end of the third year, we see this tithe of produce. So the offer is to take all the food of his land and gather it together in his gates, and then take that, and then basically it's a free for all for the Levites, for the strangers, for the fatherless, for the widows, and for them to be able to come and eat and be satisfied. And this points to Proverbs chapter 19 verse 17, where it says, "He who has pity on the poor lends to the Lord, and he will pay back what he has given." And then getting into chapter 15, we see this block of 7 years. Again, and seven is a number of completeness in the Bible. That number seven shows up quite a bit. And at the end of 7 years, we saw this earlier as the Jubilee year, all debts are to be canceled at the end of every 7 years. And not only is this monetary debts, but it's also the release of bondservants or bondservant debts. And this is with their fellow brothers. And so the Israelite people are to release their fellow Israelite bondservants, and any of their brothers who have monetary debts to them. And this even ties in certainly to today, with the Jewish nation really taking care of their own. And so no foreigners would be involved in this. And then in verse 2, it says this is called the Lord's release. The Lord has plans for Israel and plans to prosper them. Verse 5, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe with care all these commandments which I command you today. For the Lord your God will bless you, just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall not reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you. And that just seems to just play right into today when we really look at the nation of Israel. And um, again, and then swimming around in here is obeying the voice of the Lord. He's going to prosper you. It's not ours, it's God's. And we see this play out time and time again in our past studies, and even now. And then also here, recognizing that any system can be manipulated, and that man will forget the essence of what the Lord's saying. We see a warning in verse 9, and he says, beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cry out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all to which you put your hand. And looking back at verse 10, where it says, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. The Lord is a cheerful giver. And we see this also in the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7, Paul mentioning the same thing that Moses is mentioning here. The Lord loves a cheerful giver. If you're going to give. Give. Don't, if you're not, keep it. Be a Grinch. really is the essence of it. And and again, in terms of manipulating the system, I mean, just imagine. I mean, you've got this 7-year block in your mind, and so you're 6 months out from this every 7 years, and um, and a brother comes to you and wants to, needs money or needs help. Well, if you're manipulating the system, or if you're not really giving from the heart, you're thinking, man, I've only got 6 months. So if I loan this to my brother, guess what? He's going to maybe pay me back, or if he doesn't in 6 months, I've got to release him of his debt. But again, if you're going to give cheerfully. And then finally, in verse 11, we see that the poor will never cease from the land. Yet, in verse 4, so that's verse 11. If you look back in verse 4, it says, "Except when there may be no poor among you," and what appears to be a contradiction really isn't, because what it is, God's giving a command to follow, to basically keep the continual poverty from existing in the land of the chosen people. Um, so in verse 4, except when there may be no poor among you, so everyone's doing well, but they're um, everyone's going to have need at some point, so to kind of reset this every 7 years, um, so there's not this continual poverty, and what's interesting here for me is that if you were to have a microsystem of people, and in this microsystem, everybody was dealing in gold, right? And if you took up all the gold in the land and you put it in one location, inevitably, as that's distributed back out and as it finds its ways through business, or whatever exchange is going on, it's going to be separated out disproportionately. And the bottom line is there's some people who know how to make money, know how to get money, and then there are some that don't, or just or maybe aren't as concerned about it. And so if one knows how to get it, then get it, but don't let it get in the way of your heart towards God. Don't keep a fellow brother completely dispossessed and in this cycle of poverty. And really here I see grace. There's lessons to be learned. And again, I think I mentioned this in the last study when we were talking about the Jubilee year, is just, like, wow, what would it be like if we had it in place? Let's practice it. What would it be like? And then a Hebrew bondservant also is to be set free in the 7th year. Not only set free, but in verse 14, we see supplied liberally. So supplied liberally. So as the Hebrew bondservant is being let go, then if I'm the person letting the bondservant go, let's say, then I'm giving of my flock from the threshing floor and from the wine press. From what the Lord has blessed you with, you shall give to him. Again, the Lord's blessing us with this stuff. It's not ours, right? So give. And you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this thing today. And then in verse 18, it shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you these 6 years. And, in a double hired servant, so here's a bond servant who's a fellow brother who is serving. And I'm imagining if I'm serving from an oppressed context, or if I'm serving from I'm in need. I can't make it, but now I can enter into this service with my fellow brother and be taken care of, and how much I'm going to appreciate that, and give to that, and we see that here, me as a hired servant, I would have been beneficial to my master, doubly, doubly as a hired servant. And so considering this role of the bondservant, but yet has, really has freedom, not oppressed, not condemned, but free, so asking yourself, how would I work in that type of environment? And, this made me check out John, the book of John, chapter 8, verse 36, and it says, "Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." And, and that's because we're bondservants of Christ. And so being bondservants of Christ, we are that, and we're also free. We walk in this liberty. And then, we see, what if the bondservant wants to stay? Well, then, and all is taken, and it's thrust through the ear of the bondservant to the door, and then he or she will then be a servant forever. And again, we're bondservants of Christ, and that's the ultimate freedom. And then in verses 19 through 23, firstborn animals are offered to the Lord, and you're allowed to eat your share. If there is a blemish in it, do not sacrifice it unto the Lord. Yet, if it's a clean animal like the gazelle and deer, but like the gazelle and deer, it's not considered a sacrificial animal. So in other words, if it has blemish, don't sacrifice it. It's going to be like the gazelle and deer. And we see here, do not eat blood. Life is God's. And then chapter 16. In chapter 16, there are 7 annual biblical festivals, and the 3 we see here were mandatory for the men of Israel. And those 3 are the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And for these 3, they would go to the central sanctuary. In verse 2, the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. And we're going to see that in Shiloh, and then ultimately the temple in Jerusalem. And then verses 16 through 17, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, which he has given you. And then Moody comments here on the purpose of the festivals, or the feast. 1, to distinguish the people of God from other nations. 2, to keep afoot this remembrance of the benefits that they have already received. And then 3, to be a type and figure of benefits, yet further to be conferred upon them by Christ. 4, to unite God's people in holy worship. And then finally 5, to preserve purity in the holy worship prescribed by God. And it says, observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. So they're not to eat leavened bread for 7 days. And again, leaven is yeast, and it signifies just how fast they had to get out of Egypt. I mean, when the firstborn of the whole land of Egypt were taken, then they were basically, the Pharaoh said, hey, get out of here, and they were gone. They had their sandals on, they were ready to go, no yeast in their bread. So we see this. And then the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost, says, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Then you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with the tribute of a free will offering from your hand, which you shall give as the Lord your God blesses you. Let's see here. These feasts, this Feast of Weeks, this time period from Passover, from the Passover feast or the Passover to the Feast of Weeks, is exactly 50 days. And you could really spend a lot of time here and study this, because all of this lays right over to what happened, and what we're going to see happen in the New Testament with Christ. This Passover, as they were sacrificing lambs, Jesus in the New Testament is being sacrificed, and then this 50 days to the Feast of Weeks, or Pentecost. We see the same 50 days, and then the Holy Spirit that was promised by Jesus coming upon the believers in the upper room. And then let's see, Feast of Weeks, everyone celebrates, strangers alike. Points, like I said, to the day of Pentecost. And then the Feast of Tabernacles is this harvest. So in verse 13, when you have gathered from your threshing floor and your wine press, so this is the harvest, not only now and then again, now with this physical harvest, but then even too looking towards Christ and the harvest that's there for those to be saved. And then judges are to be appointed, and they must be honest, righteous, and impartial. And this imparts warning also for bribery. And 10 seconds left, guys. Here we go. Didn't make it through chapter 17, but we'll pick up again next time. God bless you. And until then, may the Lord be with you. Bye-bye.